Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. This is the show that brings you the libertarian perspective of the burning issues of the day. It's put on by the Future of Freedom Foundation, where you can find it on the internet at fff.org. You can find a weekly article by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Great to be here with you, and thanking our viewers and listeners for joining us once again.
Yeah, our website's at fff.org. And Richard, I thought this week we would discuss a principle of libertarianism that is near and dear to the hearts of all libertarians. It's in fact the core principle of libertarian philosophy, and that's the non-aggression principle. It's a very simple principle. It holds that it's morally wrong for one person to initiate force or violence or coercion against another person. What does that mean? Well, it means that I can't go and hit somebody else in the face, or I can't go and murder somebody, because what that is doing, in addition to initiating force, is that it's interfering with his ability and his right to live his life the way he wants. So the non-aggression principle says no to such things as murder, assault, rape, burglary, fraud, things that interfere with the peaceful right of people to live their lives the way they choose. Now, a corollary of the non-aggression principle, obviously, then, is that people are free to live their lives any way they want, so long as their conduct is peaceful. That is, so long as somebody's not murdering or raping or stealing or burglarizing and the like, they should be free, or legitimately they are free, to make whatever choices they want in their lives, regardless of whether everyone else agrees with those decisions or not. What is your perspective on the libertarian non-aggression principle, Richard?
Well, as I perhaps am too wont to do when we discuss these things, I would like to put it a bit in the historical context. And that is, while many people take for granted that human relationships should be free of violence and aggression, this is a relatively new concept in human history in the broadest sense. Because for most of human recorded history, it has been taken for granted that the strong, the powerful, the aggressive should be presumed to have some implicit right just by power to impose their will on others. Plunder, conquest, enslavement. These have been the means by which human relationships have been established for literally thousands of years. And the idea that an individual should be secure or protected or respected from such violence of others in the broadest sense, including from their government, is a relatively new idea. It really goes back maybe 400, maybe 500 years, certainly crystallized in its modern form in the writings of the British philosopher John Locke in his second treatise of government, which came out in the late 1600s. And that is the idea that an individual has certain essential, unalienable rights to his life, liberty, and honestly acquired property that neither governments nor private citizens can abridge and take away. Now, of course, you could go back to the ancient Hebrews with this idea that there's a higher law to which all are accountable, even kings as well as the commoners. And if the king abuses the rights of even the commoner can appeal to the higher law given by God, and to which the king himself must be subservient. But in the modern sense, it is John Locke. This idea that there were these unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to say that an individual is secure in these means that one individual should not have the authority to aggress and plunder another. Now, as you correctly pointed out, we take it for granted in everyday life. If someone were to come up and just hit me in the face, or if someone were to dash by me on the street and steal my briefcase or a woman's purse, for instance, or if someone were to put chains on me, and like these horrendous cases where young girls have been kidnapped by somebody and been kept in a basement or a dungeon-like room for years or decades. These horrendous cases that popped up a year or two ago. That certainly is human enslavement and physical abuse of the young woman by the aggressor. It's taken for granted that is inappropriate. But the idea that this should apply to governments as well is this relatively new idea of the last few centuries. The importance of it is that while you and I have the power and authority to make a claim against aggressors in the private sector, he hit me in the face. He stole my money. He somehow defrauded me by deceit and lying about some contract that I thought I was honestly entering into. But the idea that an individual should be as free from the idea of the aggression of government, this is what's new. The importance of it is that if taken seriously, it means that even a government must be limited to the securing of rights and not their violation. The tragedy that we have is that it's very difficult for people to see the connection between the two. If I can't aggress against Jacob Hornberger, then I shouldn't be able to turn to government, to have government use force to get from Jacob Hornberger that which I want. To use the analogy, if I may, that Frederick Bastiat uses in his famous essay, The Law, from the middle of the 19th century. Surely most of us would consider it unethical and wrong if I steal from you as an individual. Okay, what if I hire someone to do my dirty work, either because I'm afraid to do it, you look big and strong, and you might fight back and push and fend me off and harm me. If I hire someone to do the dirty work, is it any less wrong? No. And in fact, the law says I'm as much of as an accomplice in this violation as the actual aggressor whom I've hired. Okay, so one person. What if I hire a gang to do it? Same thing. So what happens then if in a room full of people, all of us save one decide that we're going to now plunder that one because he seems to have a sufficient number of resources or money that we could then take from him and divide among ourselves as a private gang? Would we consider that ethical and moral? And in that presentation of it, most people still would say that it's wrong. Well, then you just change it as Bastiat does and say, well, let us suppose that large group of people in a room is society. And let us suppose that there is one individual separating the rest who has something that large majority wants. Now, let us suppose that large majority elects someone who they call politician or policeman. And they now instruct that politician and policeman to take from that one individual, and after paying the policeman his salary for performing this function for us, we now divvy up what that person had among ourselves. Is that any less right? Well, we would normally say wrong, but now what if we say we're talking about government and democracy and the political regime? By merely changing the names from the gang, the group of thugs, to the high, enlightened conception of government and political power and authority and majoritarian decision-making, is it less wrong? And of course, Bastiat says it is equally wrong as when one or a private gang does it, as when the government does it. That's what he calls the difference between illegal plunder and legalized plunder. That is what people find it difficult to understand, because they have fallen under the mythology, yet the idea of inspired by people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century French philosopher, that there is the society, and the society is a collective in itself with its own will. He referred to it as the general will. And if the people of this collective make a decision, how can it be wrong? How can people oppress themselves if it's their own choice? Surely no one person could accuse himself of oppressing himself in the decisions that he makes, as long as he can make those decisions on his own. Well, if we're the collective group and we decide, it's not an enslavement. It is an act of free decision. And it's that mythology that somehow, by politicizing what a group wants, you make it acceptable to do to particular individuals what a private individual would consider it unethical to do, is the great danger that we have, and makes it difficult for people to see that aggression against an individual by one other private individual is not only wrong, but it's wrong when a group of people attempt to do it through an agency that they now label the state or the government or the political authority.
Yeah, the distinction that you're drawing is between the private sector and the government sector, and for some reason, while people see the wrongfulness of initiating force within the private arena, they sort of go morally blind when it comes to the government. I mean, if you take things like murder and rape and theft and burglary, I think 99.99% of people would say that is absolutely wrong from a moral sense. People should be punished for this. And so that's really why we call government into existence. I mean, this is what Jefferson's pointing out in the Declaration of Independence. To secure these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, government is called into existence. Well, what for? Well, to punish those that are going to be violating the rights of other people, the murderers, the rapists, the thieves, the burglars, the rapists. So now there can be a legitimate debate, and there often is in the libertarian movement, as to how to fund this limited function of government. Should it be with taxes, where money is forcibly extracted from people, or should it be done voluntarily? But I think most people believe that there is a legitimate role for government in stopping this type of thing. And notice, Richard, that nobody's rights are being violated with a government, at least with one that's voluntarily funded, that has this monopoly of force that to punish murderers, rapists, and thieves. If you're not doing any of those things, then you don't need to ever worry about government interfering with you. What ends up happening, though, is that those powers to punish murderers, rapists, thieves, and violent people sometimes start expanding beyond that. They expand to the destruction of liberty. And that this is also what Jefferson was pointing out, that sometimes governments become destructive of the very ends for which they were designed to protect. That is, they destroy liberty. A good example of this is like drugs. Now, we know that a lot of people ingest illicit drugs. We can argue all day long over whether it's harmful, the extent of the harm, but let's just assume that ingesting any illicit substance is harmful to the person. If we concede that, that still doesn't follow that I, in the private sector, have a right to go and initiate force against you to stop you from using drugs or selling drugs or whatever. Because why? Because by ingesting drugs, selling drugs, transacting drugs, you're just engaging in peaceful behavior. You're not initiating force against anyone. Now, if you go and initiate force while under the influence of drugs, or drive a car and hit somebody, then you're going to be responsible for it. But the simple act of choosing to use drugs is entirely peaceful. And so I think most people would agree that it's wrong to go and kidnap a person and lock him up in order to break his drug addiction. Instead, people would say, well, you can talk to him and try to persuade him and educate him. But all of a sudden, when you have government enter the equation, people get this moral blind spot. And they say, well, but if it's most people that have decided that it's wrong to do this, then what's wrong with government initiating force against peaceful people who are ingesting drugs? And so you end up with this huge monstrosity of the drug war with all kinds of collateral damage. I mean, people are still ingesting drugs despite the viciousness of this war. They're still ingesting drugs in the Philippines, where they're actually killing suspected drug users without even a trial or arrest or anything like that. You've got all the collateral violence, the drug wars, the drug gangs, the drug lords, all that come into existence because of this violation of the non-aggression principle. A violation by government itself, by people acting collectively through the force of government. And so that's why we libertarians talk in terms of what should be the role of government in a free society. Should it be to initiate force against people, like in the drug war? Or should it be limited to punishing people who are initiating force in the private sector, like murderers, rapists, and thieves? And we hold that if you limit government to its legitimate function, then you've established the foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, free society. That doesn't mean that everybody's exercising their peaceful choices in ways that everyone else agrees with. but everyone acknowledges that the real test of a free society is not whether you're free to exercise choices that everybody agrees with, but whether you're free to exercise choices that everyone disagrees with, so long as those choices are peaceful.
Well, the frustrating element that you're referring to, that when it goes to the level of government, people seem to have a blank spot in extending the logic of how they would judge private action to the political arena, is basically because of these misplaced metaphors that I was alluding to about, like Rousseau and the general will of the community as a whole. This week on the FF website, the title of my article is "Society is not a family, government is not a parent." And the metaphor is often used by those, especially, though not exclusively, on the left, those on the, to use that general categorization, the collectivist right, also use this metaphor of the family, the group, the culture, the society. But there's particularly this idea that society is an extended family. Now, within a family, don't all the family members have a sense of an obligation to share, to contribute, to help out, to support, to give up certain things if another family member is in trouble or is ill or has a hardship? Of course. And in the family, isn't there a need to sort of direct how these things are done? And that's what the role of parents are for. Parents assign children tasks and duties and obligations and responsibilities as they think the individual children in the family are capable and responsible at different ages as they're growing up to handle these tasks. And then there's this presumption, therefore, that government is this way, that government is the parent, and the parent sort of oversees the obligations and duties and responsibilities that all of us in the social family owe to each other. Of course, the two issues that arise from this, one is, who determines who the parents are? Now, of course, the left always talks about such things as participatory democracy. But the bottom line in the real world of modern democratic politics is you have coalition groups who gel together, elect politicians who promise to use the power of government through regulation or taxing to give those groups what they want if they succeed in getting him in office. And then they impose their desires, wills, belief systems, ideologies on the rest of the society. All of those who did not support it, did not vote, or did not vote for that candidate. The other thing here is that in a family, at least in the modern family that we live in, if a parent abuses a child through physical force, severe psychological intimidation, it is now considered normal that you call, quote, social services to investigate. And if there seems to be evidence of it, the child is removed for its own safety. And the parent is faced with not only loss of custody of their child, but maybe a real jail time if physical abuse has occurred. Now, I'm not defending social services. I realize that they can overreach and be abusive themselves. But there's an idea that even a parent cannot violate the inherent implicit rights of a helpless or innocent or young child. But if the government is abusive in your view, what it does, the means it chooses to do it, the regulatory and tax burdens it imposes upon you, can you call some social services? Can you extract or escape yourself from the tutelage of this political parent that claims the authority to make you do what it wants, live the way it thinks you should, determine the distribution of your income that you've earned? Of course not. You have no escape from it with the state. And these extended metaphors and analogies are what wrap people's minds in. Yeah, well, we're all in a community. We're all part of the social family. Yeah. Someone has to sort of see that everyone is paying their fair share in the social family. And government is just determining that Johnny does this chore. Sammy has to give this much of his allowance. That means the money he's privately earned in the private sector in the political session, and we'll see that Sally has some extra money. That's called redistribution of wealth. These metaphors capture people's minds, and then it makes it very difficult to them to see that when government does these things in violation of our rights rather than the respecting or protecting of them, as you were making the distinction, that you then destroy the very rights that government is to exist for, and now those rights are plundered to serve some in the social family at the expense of the others, and that what makes it harmful, dangerous, oppressive, and in the views of many classical liberals and libertarians, unethical and immoral.
Yeah, your point about the family is a good one. I mean, you know, when Johnny, the little kid, puts something bad in his mouth in the family, you know, what does what do the parents do? They say, Johnny, bad. You put something bad in your mouth, go to your room. Well, then Johnny all of a sudden turns out to be a 40-year-old banker who's putting something illicit into his mouth, and there's his daddy or mommy, the state, saying, Johnny, bad. Put something bad in your mouth, go to your room, which is a room in a penitentiary. And you raise the concept here indirectly of charity. I mean, here's another example of where people have this moral blind spot when it comes to the libertarian non-aggression principle. I mean, as you know, Richard, FFF is a nonprofit foundation. We rely on donations to fund our operations. So we ask people, would you send us a donation? But understanding that people have the right to say no. I mean, it's their money. And let's say we're sitting in a room with 100 people, and 55 are libertarians and 45 are non-libertarians. We would have the right to stand up in front of that room and say, hey, would you donate to the Future of Freedom Foundation? And everybody that wants to writes his check or puts money into the basket that's being passed around. But those 45 that are not libertarians, along with the libertarians also, have a right to say no. It's their money. I think everybody can see that clearly. Now, suppose there's a vote taken in that room, though, and the vote turns out to be 55 to 45 to give donations to the Future of Freedom Foundation. Well, does that mean that the 55 now have the right to go in there and forcibly take money from the 45 in order to give it to FFF? We would say, of course not. I mean, that you have these fundamental rights, and one of these fundamental rights is to do what you want with your own money. You decide whether to give it to FFF or anyone else. Again, then, as soon as things enter into the political arena, that moral blind spot appears for all too many people. Not for libertarians, who continue to see the issue very clearly, but for non-libertarians, who all of a sudden say, oh, well, we live in a democracy. Majority rules. And when you ask them, well, really, will you have majority rule on what books people read, or what positions they take publicly in speeches and articles? And they'll respond, oh, no, freedom of speech, that's a fundamental right. But they have that moral blind spot when it comes to the right of people to decide for themselves what to do with their own money. So libertarians would say, look at Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, aid to dictatorships. I mean, all across the board, this notion of taking money from people in order to give it to other people through the taxing process is immoral, because you're initiating force to take one person's money and give it to another person. You're not even just taxing people to pay for this limited function of government. You've gone beyond that. You're now taxing people in order to give their money to other people, which is absolutely no different in principle from a private sector thief doing the exact same thing.
Now, wait a second here. If we can get 55% of the population to agree that the government should fund FFF, and we can plunder the other 45%, does that mean that you'll pay me more money? I have to rethink this. I have to rethink that. Of course.
We need to send you to Libertarian Re-Education Camp. Force you to attend.
Now, by the way, my satire there also explains part of the problem. And that is, once that it's viewed as legitimate that the state can take the money or the wealth of some and redistribute it in this way, it becomes highly tempting for individuals suddenly to start compromising implicitly or explicitly in their own mind the right and wrong of things. Well, Bob over there is a farmer, and he's been getting a subsidy from the government that pays him to cover part of the cost of his operations, or, my gosh, he even gets paid for not growing crops and leaving the land fallow. Now, and then this fellow's getting a steel subsidy, or that person is getting a protection from foreign competition. And in all direct and indirect ways, they're basically getting favors and privileges for themselves in various ways at the expense of others. Well, if it's right for them, what would be wrong for me to receive this as well? And as a consequence, once this barrier is broken down, that the government should not have the authority, right, or duty to do anything that a private individual could not do without being considered immoral, unethical, and beyond legal bounds. Once you break down that barrier, then it's sort of like the avalanche, right? The little pebble that starts rolling down the hill, and suddenly it picks up steam and it brings down the whole mountain. It breaks down the ethical barriers that people take for granted. That's, well, certain things are just not done. And one of the things that used to be taken in a country like America that is just not done, for the most part, there were exceptions. Corruption, unfortunately, has always existed, even in U.S. history, was that you didn't turn to the government to get something you wanted that you could not acquire through peaceful and voluntary exchange with your neighbor through mutual agreement. That barrier has been broken down so that, well, gee, you know, if the government is going to give wealth to other people, well, maybe they should give it to FFF, and then I'll get a bigger salary, and other people are. You see what I'm saying, Jacob? That becomes, it has undermined the most important ethical barriers in the society until it's now taken for granted. It's fair game and anything goes.
Absolutely, and there's a distortion of understanding of rights. Instead of, I have a right to live my life the way I want so long as my conduct is peaceful, the principle becomes, I have a right to take your money from you as long as I do it through the political process. Or I have a right to put you in jail for ingesting substances that I don't agree with so long as I do it through the political process. Right. I mean, it really highlights, Richard, the distinction that the United States had throughout the 19th century. I mean, if you eliminate slavery from the equation, and you look at the fact that there was no Social Security, no Medicare, no income tax, no farm subsidies, no minimum wage laws, very few economic regulations, no immigration controls, because of this mindset that people should be free to engage in peaceful activity, it really goes to show you how unique that society was. And today, all of that's been warped and perverted into, I got a right to take your money. And you see this especially with Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, farm subsidies and the like. I have a right to get into your pocketbook so long as I do it through the government. And then, as you point out, once you get on the dole, it's virtually impossible to get off. It's worse than heroin. It's like, well, how would I survive without my Social Security or my Medicare or my Obamacare and the like? And Obamacare, as a matter of fact, is another example of this. You've got this mandate. Imagine in what purports to be a free society, forcing people to buy insurance, and now people are dependent on this system. 7 years of dependency. You've got all too many people saying, oh, well, no, now we're stuck with it because we couldn't do without it. How would we survive? We'd all be dying without it.
Exactly. And that's why that very thing is that we should have government impose FFF care. Everyone has to mandatorily subscribe to FFF. And then after they've had it for a while, they can't imagine being without it. So we'll never have to worry about losing it.
Excellent reasoning, Richard. Not.
But the problem is that is the thing. You know, Obamacare has been in effect only a handful of years since the Democratic Congress and Obama's signature as president began the process of bringing it into effect. But even in that handful of years, the spider's web of groups in the society, from people who receive insurance to those who receive government redistributions of wealth to cover them through government subsidies and guarantees, has already made it seemingly impossible to find anyone in Congress who will just say, repeal it. Let's not have reform, just repeal it. And let's reform and repeal Medicare and Medicaid as well, and move to a totally, absolutely private, competitive health market that the government has no responsibility for other than the usual rules of protecting against violence and fraud. Nobody is even thinking about that. And that shows that same mindset that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I know we're about out of time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention all the military welfare, all the people that are dependent on the largesse that comes with the military welfare state, and all these foreign interventions. I mean, they've become dependent on these, despite the manifest debacle in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. You know, every single regime change operation has been a debacle in terms of loss of life and liberty and destruction of property. And yet there's this dependencies that has developed on it now. Look at all the contractors that depend on the weapon supplies and so forth. And so it just keeps going on and on because the government says we have a right to oust regimes in other countries. The contractors say we have a right to our military welfare. And it just keeps going on. And when you combine the welfare state with the warfare state, the whole thing's taking the country down, Richard.
Absolutely. And that's why we have to always emphasize and attempt to help bring about the rediscovery and the articulation of those first principles of individual rights against which neither private persons nor governments may aggress.
Yeah, and then central to that is the Libertarian Non-Aggression Principle. I hope you all enjoyed the show. If you want more, we've got all the Libertarian angles archived on our website at fff.org. We publish a weekly article by Richard every Monday morning, and I have a daily blog analyzing what's going on in the world from a libertarian perspective. And our mission is to present this uncompromising, pure libertarian message, because we believe not only that ideas matter, that they move societies, but also that principles cannot be compromised. Richard, enjoyed the show. Look forward to talking to you next week.
Till next time.